Hello and welcome back to this course, covering the exam topics for the JNCIS ENT certification. In this section of the course, we're reviewing ISIS concepts, configuration, and monitoring in Junos. In this lesson, we'll be covering the configuration steps for implementing ISIS. Since ISIS is a routing protocol that was originally created for an entirely separate protocol stack than TCP over IP, the configuration steps are slightly more complicated than OSPF. ISIS was developed as a link state protocol for the OSI protocol stack. In the OSI protocol stack, we don't have MAC addresses or IP addresses. Rather, we have Network Service Access Points, or NSAP addresses. Because of this, ISIS does not use IP as the network layer protocol to exchange packets. Although it does use the Ethernet frame header as it is integrated ISIS, which is meant to be functional with the IP protocol stack. So, let's first see an overview of the configuration steps required to implement ISIS before we jump into each configuration requirement in more detail. We see here that we've broken down the configuration requirements for ISIS into 4 steps. First, we'll need to configure the ISO family on the loopback along with a NET address. NET, or Network Entity Title, is the ISO address used to refer to this device in the OSI protocol suite. Although it's not required to configure this address on the loopback interface, it is recommended best practice. This address will need to be accessible from all interfaces running ISIS, and therefore will be simpler both in address planning and configuration to set the address on the loopback interface rather than all of the participating interfaces. Once our loopback interface is configured, we'll need to enable the ISO protocol family on all logical interfaces which will be participating in ISIS. If the NET address is configured on the loopback interface, then there is no need to configure an NET address on the participating interfaces. The family ISO configuration command must simply be present on the interface logical units. This completes the interface configuration prerequisites for ISIS. And now the ISIS protocol may be configured. In the protocol's ISIS configuration hierarchy, we'll set each participating interface in much the same way as in OSPF. By default, all interfaces will operate in L1/L2 mode, though may be configured on a per interface basis as to whether we wish for them to form level 1 or level 2 adjacencies. Finally, if we're configuring ISIS on a VSRX or SRX, we'll either need to allow ISIS PDUs through the security configuration hierarchy, or set the ISO family forwarding mode to packet-based to allow the ISO packets to be processed. As you've seen several times before in this course, we've set the MPLS family forwarding mode to packet-based often, to have the SRX operate in packet mode rather than flow mode, so we don't need to worry about the configuring of stateful firewall filters to allow the various routing protocol traffic. Since ISIS operates over the ISO protocol family, we need to configure the ISO family forwarding mode to packet-based as well. Great. So, starting from the top, let's step through each of these configuration requirements and review the example configurations. As we mentioned a little earlier, any interface may be used to supply a network entity title address for the device to use. However, a loopback interface is recommended as it will be usable from all interfaces as long as one of the interfaces are up. In this configuration snippet, we see that we have the family ISO configuration statement under the logical unit of the loopback interface. The address configured under the ISO family is a much different format than an IP address. Unlike OSPF, where the area configuration is done at the OSPF protocol configuration, with ISIS, the area is defined in the ISO address. The first two sections of the address here define the area, as illustrated in the diagram to the right as well. We are configuring R1, which is shown at the bottom of the diagram. As we learned in a previous lesson, an entire router in ISIS is wholly within an area, rather than just the interface. This is the configuration that is related to that statement. Below, we have the set commands used to apply the same configuration shown. Now that we've configured the needed ISO address on the loopback interface, let's move on to the next step, configuring the ISO protocol family on the logical interfaces that will participate in ISIS. As we see in our configuration snippet here, the family ISO configuration statement is under the logical interface that will participate in ISIS. Because it is in the logical interface hierarchy, separate logical interfaces which are tagged with separate VLANs may participate in ISIS. This interface is tagged with the VLAN ID 3905. As we mentioned earlier, we do not need to configure a NET address on the participating logical interfaces. Only the ISO protocol family must be present for the ISIS PDUs to be sent and received on the interface. Therefore, we simply have the family ISO configuration statement here under the logical interface, which is all that's needed. Next, we'll configure the ISIS protocol and set the participating interfaces. ISIS is configured under the protocol's ISIS configuration hierarchy. The default behavior is for Junos devices to originate both Level 1 and Level 2 Hello PDUs. Though here, we have disabled Level 2 on this router. Therefore, it will only originate Level 1 PDUs. As we see in the diagram, R1 is only a Level 1 router, and therefore should not attempt to form any Level 2 adjacencies. Each logical interface which should participate in ISIS and originate Hello PDUs is listed, and we have configured a manual reference bandwidth which will be used for the cost calculations. And that's it. This is all of the configuration that's needed to get ISIS working on a Junos device. The last step, though, that I want to cover is something that's needed on SRX devices. So we don't need to explicitly allow the ISIS packets through the stateful firewall configuration. As we've covered several times before, since the SRX is a firewall by default, it ships with a default configuration that enables stateful firewalling. This is called flow mode. This mode is not only the default for IP protocols configured in the MPLS forwarding family, but is also the default for the ISO protocol family. With flow mode configured, any interfaces which are not assigned to a security zone will have the traffic dropped by default. This will present itself as adjacencies simply not forming after you believe the configuration is complete. We're just using the SRX as a router and do not wish to configure any stateful firewalling. Then we'll need to put the ISO protocol family into the packet-based forwarding mode, in the same way as we do for the MPLS protocol family. In the configuration snippet here, we see the same mode packet-based configuration statement under the ISO family as the MPLS family in the forwarding options section of the security configuration hierarchy. Below, we have the equivalent set commands used to apply this configuration. This concludes the configuration necessary for enabling a router and logical interfaces to participate in the ISIS routing protocol. I hope that this lesson has been informative for you, and I would like to thank you for viewing.